Good morning, everyone. It's good to see all of you here this morning. We're going to be in Hebrews chapter 11 and Genesis chapter 12, if you have a Bible with you. If not, we have it on YouVersion for you this morning as well. I don't know about you, but I'm kind of refreshed with an extra hour. Anybody else feel that way? It's good stuff. I'm just going to take off on the scripture because it's going to center everything that we do today. Back in the By Faith series. Verse 23, Hebrews chapter 11. It says, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ. I find it astonishing that Moses considered the reproach of Christ, and he's 1,500 years away. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. And by faith he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. By faith the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry ground. But the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. May God add his blessing to the reading and hearing of his holy and perfect word. So we've toured through Hebrews 11. We're back here this morning after spending a few weeks looking at what City on a Hill's all about. And basically, as we've gone through Hebrews 11, here's what we've seen. We've seen some messed up cats be called to be faithful. That's good news for us, a bunch of messed up cats. I hope that you're catching this, that God did not look down and see great men. He didn't look down and see Moses and see a great man and choose him according to his greatness. He didn't look down and see Jacob and see a great man and choose Jacob according to his greatness. He didn't come alongside them to use their greatness to carry out his story. No, he took average sinners, sometimes spectacular sinners, like we see today, Moses, who commits murder in Exodus chapter 2. And he's given this faithfulness from God. They are given this faithfulness from God. If you look at the beginning of that passage that we just read very carefully there in the first verse that we read, verse 23, it says that basically Moses' faithfulness was imparted to him as a baby. Nothing good that Moses ever did. There was nothing good in him. So it's not the faithfulness of man that we see come to bear as we study the scriptures closely. It's the character of God given to show the coming Christ. That's the entire Old Testament. If you read the Old Testament any other way than that, you will foul it up. If you teach your children the Old Testament any other way than that, you will foul it up. It's the entire Old Testament. The entire Old Testament is a redemption story of Jesus unfolding. So our big idea this morning is this. It's in your sermon notes there if you want to follow along. Moses was a deliverer. If you had to title Moses something, you would say he's a deliverer. Small d. But he was not the deliverer, capital D. And because we too are slaves. See, we see those poor Hebrew people and we go, oh, poor slaves. They had to trudge in straw to make bricks. Poor slaves, but we're slaves too. Slaves to sin. And we need deliverance just like the Hebrew people of Moses' day. And then the biggest part of the big idea is that Jesus is the greater Moses. Let's dig into the passage that we just read carefully. And we'll see 4 things this morning. First one is this, that Moses' story showed that God is sovereign. His story will unfold. So if we do a little backstory, we would see that the Pharaoh that loved Joseph is long dead. The Hebrews have now been enslaved for quite some time by an evil Pharaoh. And the Hebrew people have grown to at least 1 million folks. And I don't know about you, but anytime you ever see somebody in power, when they have that power threatened, there's a problem, right? He sees that the multitudes are getting too large. Anybody remember the story from the Roman days of the emperors? They would, like Nero, he would worry about the feelings of the mob. Very similar deal here with Pharaoh. He got worried about this 1 million people, and he ordered the death of all male babies of the Jews. So that's what we do when our kingdom is threatened. That's what we do when our kingdom is threatened. We start whacking people. It might take a little different form than killing babies, but we start whacking people out of our lives because they threaten the kingdom of me. And so baby Moses here would have been targeted for death. And like the Romans of Jesus' time, the Egyptians were professionals at death. They had death figured out. They knew who to kill, and they knew where to kill them and how to kill them, and they were very efficient. So if you go read this story in Exodus chapter 2, you'll see that God has an opinion about what I'm saying right now. I guess so. You can see that the providential protection of God here is amazing. Right? We have an innocent baby who has no military protection whatsoever that ends up as the adopted half-brother of the future Pharaoh, and with a bonus, he gets taken care of by his mother on a daily basis. Astonishing. Too good. So I'd ask you to consider right now, have you ever had a time in your life that you just should have been dead or in prison? I think back to a life of depravity with me, and while there was not a Pharaoh trying to kill me, I was bent on self-destruction. Maybe you can relate to that. It was just like the prince of me gone bad. Breaking Bad, you might say. Should have been dead a couple of times, I know for sure. And just so you know, I have 2 recurring nightmares. One of them is simply this. I drove a car one night when I should not have. Literally took the car airborne into a field, and it landed so hard that it popped all 4 tires. And it didn't do anything but damage the car, but my recurring nightmare is that car lands on some children. And I'm spending the rest of my life in prison, as I should, for killing some kids while living a life of depravity. Maybe you have some stories in your life that would be a prevalent thing that rolls through your mind. Well, I have some good news for you here this morning. We don't have to stay in that nightmare. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but here's what I know on that night was that it was an isolated field, and I was protected from death and from prison. The sovereign God, like he kept Moses out of the hands of the Egyptians and from the death that they would bring, protected me on that night as well. See, because I think God wanted me here with you today. So I'm here by his mercy, not because he saw anything good in me, but simply by his sovereign mercy. And I'm glad he's protected you also, so we could walk this thing out together. Number 2, like Moses, Jesus chose to be mistreated rather than to enjoy sin. Let me reread verses 25 and 26 to you. It says, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God, this is Moses, than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Moses walked away from earthly riches. He had become the prince. If you know the story, you're going to need to go back and read the backstory later today maybe. And he was mistreated for the sake of the gospel. For the sake of the gospel. Because what we're supposed to see as we reread that story is not Moses, but a shadow of Christ Because look at what Jesus walked away from. I mean, we get some earthly views, right? He said, as Satan tempted the incarnate Jesus in Luke chapter 4, Jesus can't accept what he already owns. Have you ever not found that astonishing, that Satan comes and tempts Jesus with what he owns? Psalm 24 says that the whole earth is the Lord's and everything in it, and yet Satan comes and tempts Jesus and says, you can have the whole earth. Let me read it to you. Luke 4, it says, and the devil took him up and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment in time, and said to him, to you I will give all authority and their glory. This is the Jesus now. For it has been delivered to me, and I give it to whom I will. But let me just say this to you. You have to remember that Jesus also is 100% man. He is you and me standing there listening to that at the moment. Filled with the Holy Spirit, but he set aside his kingly robes. He hasn't set aside any of his divinity, but he has set aside his kingly robes, only filled with the Spirit now to be able to resist this temptation. Just like you and me. What would you do, honestly, if Satan said you could have the whole thing? We all go, well, yeah, Jesus, I mean, he owned the whole thing anyway, so he just walked that out. But he had, at that time, done as Moses had done. He had set aside his kingly robes. He had put aside his princehood for our sake, so that he would have to look at resisting the fleeting pleasures of sin. He told him basically, you can have your kingdom reestablished here now. You don't have to wait. Because Satan knew that if he could get Jesus to agree to that, the cross would not come. It said, Jesus answered him, it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve. Jesus turned down the fleeting pleasures of this life for the good of eternity, just like Moses. And so my question for us this morning is this. Do we, you and me, turn down the pleasures of this life for the good of eternity? Really? Really? Moses walked away from a palace and being a prince. Jesus set aside his kingly robes and came down. Moses chose to join his people in slavery. Yes? Does that not astonish you? Jesus chose to take his people's slavery upon his shoulders at the cross. Jesus is the greater Moses. All of the sin cast on him who never sinned. It's good news for you and me. All of the sin cast on him who never sinned. Are you serious? See, our slavery is not from Egyptians. It's not from another man. It never is. It's to sin. And Jesus died to take all the sin. He is the deliverer, capital D. And let me just mention this real quick. I think most Christians live in a future salvation mode. I have a real concern for this body of believers right here, that we tend to live in a future salvation mode. So in other words, I really think that life is supposed to be completely miserable here because and I understand that there's a better day coming out there. And we really don't believe at the end of the day that Christ died and rose again to free us from our past. Because it would be easy for me to live my life in light of that depravity that I lived in when I took that car airborne. When I was maybe the most selfish man on the planet, now I'm only the second most selfish. But we really don't believe that Christ died and rose again to free us from our past and to bring blessing to our present. We've gotten so kind of inoculated to the prosperity gospel that we almost can't see that God wants to bless us in the present. So we live in the horrors of our past and the lack of blessing in our present, and therefore we don't feel free to live free of this world to get done what God has to do. If you want to share some time between services, I'd be happy to sit down and talk to you about, what it might look like to come alongside CV, who I met with this week and is coming into the fold. He's probably going to join Bridge Network from the great nation of India with its 187 churches and his dream of planting 5,000 more churches and unreached people groups before 2020, and he'll do it. But he needs us to pray for him. He needs us to set aside our cares of this world and to pray for him, because he gets more done in a day, honestly, than most Christians get done in a year. Just to be blunt about it, for the sake of the gospel and for the sake of the King. And so, what are we going to do with that? What are we going to do with that? I think some of us think that all of our joy is coming in heaven. And I think we need to walk that out in DNA with each other. I think you need to sit down with those two other people that you're meeting with and say, why not now? Why not now? And let's walk free from slavery today. Because number 3 is Moses trusted the blood of the Lamb, and so should we. Moses trusted the blood of the Lamb, and so should we. At City on a Hill, we talk a lot about story, right? We want to tell stories. And this is a story. This happened. This is a story. We ask this, though. What is the prevailing story in our lives? You should ask yourself that question every minute of every day. What is the prevailing story of my life right now? Is it this nightmare that I'm walking in, or is the story the freedom from slavery that Christ has brought? Is that the prevailing story? Well, from the time of Moses through the return of Christ, and even now up to today, when we take Holy Communion today, the Passover was the prevailing story. I don't know if you caught that in Hebrews 11 there, but it brought up the Passover. So why Moses walked by faith, because that's a key part of our story. It's not a Jewish story. Everybody walking with me, tracking with this? It is our story. And here's why. God liked it that way because the story, the prevailing story, was that it stared at a spotless lamb, a perfect lamb that was to come to cause the shadow of death to what? Pass over. To pass over. Let's read the story. This is in Exodus chapter 12, if you want to flip over there with me. I'm going to start in verse 3. Whoops, that's Genesis. That would be about Abraham. Another by faith dude. Exodus chapter 12, verse 3. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons, according to what each of you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish. Lock that in, underline it, highlight it, whatever you mark in a Bible. The lamb shall be without blemish, a male, a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of the month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall eat it. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted, its head with its legs and its inner parts. And you shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. In this manner you shall eat it, with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in hand. That's because you're free. It's time to go from slavery. Yes? And you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. I want you to notice, it is the Lord's Passover. You're about to get passed over, but it's the Lord's Passover. This is his story. For I will pass through the land of Egypt, God says, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. I am the Lord. This is God's story. He judges how he pleases. Don't ever forget it. He judges who, when, and where, how he pleases. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. Listen to this. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. Provision of life in the face of the judgment death of God. You can't get any more today than what we just read. Provision of life in the face of the judgment death of God. See, because we too have a shadow of death hanging over us. It is here. Judgment is always here. If you've ever done the funeral of somebody you did not think was a Christian, it's one of the most grueling things you can ever sit through in your life, just in case you don't think the shadow of death, this same shadow of death hangs over us today. It is frightening to sit there to consider that this person did not have blood over their doorposts. Yes? But if the prominent story of your life, the story of your life is your belief that the blood of a precious lamb over your doorposts causes the shadow to once again pass over, this it shall. As usual, see, we're not learning that Moses was a great man and we should emulate the faith of Moses. What we're learning is that every bit of the story of Moses is actually the great narrative of Jesus. It all points to the great deliverer. It all points to the blood that was poured out of him to bring great glory to God as we would trust the blood of the Lamb. Not the law of Moses. 10 Commandments are coming later in the story, right? But it's not the law of Moses. It's whether we're going to trust the blood of the Lamb. That's why this Passover is what we celebrate today. The shadow of death is passing over your house today if the blood of the Lamb is on the doorposts. Is the blood of the Lamb on the doorpost? This is going to sound like way Baptist right here, right now, and that's cool, right? Is the blood of the Lamb on your doorpost? We have to recognize. Say that with me. Say this with me. Trust the blood of the Lamb. Say it. Trust the blood of the Lamb. Say it again. Trust the blood of the Lamb. That's it. That's the whole gospel. The good news is that we deserve to die, and we don't have to die. The shadow of death will pass over us if the blood of the Lamb is on our doorpost. We can cut this sermon down to like 2 sentences, right? Some of you wish we would, maybe. I don't know. But the shadow of death, killing all the firstborn of Egypt, I want you to see, crushed Pharaoh for a moment, and it set free the slaves for a moment. And then the story of the Passover became the prominent story of the people of God for almost 1,500 years. I say we bring it back. I say we bring it back as the prominent story of the people of God. I don't know if we got to like eat all the inner parts of a lamb or anything like that, but I'm just saying, let's bring the story back as the prominent story. Because the story of the blood of the Lamb must become our prominent, our dominant story, the one that drives everything that we do. People say, what do you mean that you're gospel-centered? What do you mean that you're gospel-saturated? What do those terms mean? What it means is that the story of the blood drives everything about us. Say, well, why would I give up earthly stuff to plant churches in India? Because the blood drives everything about us. It's not our side story. Most Americans who hang around church, the gospel, the story of the blood of the Lamb, the Passover story, is their side story. Let it not be so in this room. That's what it is when you're a Christian. When the story of the pouring blood pours out of you. That's what it means to be a Christian. The story of the blood pours out of you. But has anybody ever noticed this? That when you get saved, Satan doesn't stop trying to kill you? Anybody ever caught that? Anybody walking in that maybe this morning? It's the same in this story. I don't know if you catch this in Hebrews 11, but Pharaoh has this rehardening of a heart. Everybody remember Like you saw the Cecil B. DeMille's movie or The Prince of Egypt or something, and right, the slaves are free, but then Pharaoh wakes up, he's in a bad mood, didn't get enough sleep, and he realizes he wants to crush God and his people. And so the deliverance from, like the Passover, this movement of imminent death was not complete. Because Pharaoh changed his mind and tried to kill them all. But, number 4, in your sermon notes there, the deliverer will save his people and crush the enemy. Jesus finishes the deal. Because we can talk about the blood of the Lamb all we want. He went into a tomb from being the blood of the Lamb, right? But he doesn't stay there. And so there's a story of life beyond the story of death. See, these folks at the time when they get like pressed up against the sea, and they've got all of Pharaoh's best army coming down at them, they thought they were going to die. Do you remember them crying? What, you carried us out of slavery just so we could die in the desert, right? Faith is dwindling. This God who just rolled out these 10 plagues, and they heard the cries throughout the land that God always does what he says he will do, because he always does what's good, right, and perfect. But they thought they were going to die. And so what's the prominent story of our life? We kind of always think we're going to die. We always think that death is imminent. It kind of backs us up against a raging sea, because we've been set free, but we keep looking at the things around us like Pharaoh's army, and we're going, it doesn't feel free. I see death coming. I see the enemy looking like it's winning, facing Pharaoh and his powerful army of chariots. And those people kind of felt like the only way they were going to live through the day was if they were at the back of the line of the million people, and the soldiers just got tired, right? They got cramp in their arm from hack and catch, and so that's the only way I will probably live through the day. But I want you to look at verses 13 and 14 that say this. Exodus 14. It says, and Moses said to the people, fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you only have to be silent. That's a great bit of news, isn't it? That I can rest. I don't have to fight all the things that I see around me. I rest in that which has already been done. And I say, deliverance. That's deliverance. But this deliverance wasn't so that Cecil B. DeMille could make a movie, or maybe there's a new one coming out this fall, right? It's not for our entertainment. It's not so that we can read exciting stories from the Old Testament and be motivated. That's not what it is. It's a shadow of a complete miraculous rescue yet to come. Let me say something that'll be a little controversial to you. See, the death of Jesus was not miraculous. I don't know if you've ever thought about this before, but there were a lot of good men nailed to a cross. You ever think about that? There were a lot of men nailed to a cross by Romans. So the death of Jesus was not miraculous. Now, what was miraculous was the Father casting all of your sin upon that qualified death. That was miraculous. And then Jesus walking out of a tomb, that was miraculous. So when those Hebrews walk across that dry seabed to complete deliverance, and the enemy has been crushed, see the resurrection. See the resurrection of Jesus. See the thing complete. Because deliverance from death was complete, because he who was killed so that we would not have to die didn't stay dead. Resurrection sealed the deal. See, Jesus is God himself, and he lives. He lives. I told you, anybody check Facebook this morning? I said, this is going to be like Easter, man. Right? To me, the crossing of the sea and the waves coming back in over across the top of the Egyptians in judgment is like the defeat of Satan. It is complete. Satan is crushed like those Egyptian soldiers. And I say, let us live like it. Let us live like it. Let's not live all in future look at salvation. Let us live with it now.